what is a metaphor? Well, to begin with, it's a figurative rather than literal mode of speech. And in its simplest case, it's of the form X is Y, where a primary subject, X, is talked about in terms of a secondary subject, Y. And briefly, our understanding of the first element in the metaphor, X, is reframed in terms of the second element. So in Shakespeare's famous Juliet is the Sun, our understanding of Juliet is reframed and restructured in terms of the sun. And in Dickinson's Hope is a Thing with Feathers, hope is likened to a bird, and our understanding of hope is reframed in terms of bird-like features. Now, one may wonder what philosophers have to do with metaphors. So are we just here trying to steal literary theorists' jobs? Well, actually, metaphors give rise to a number of philosophical puzzles that can be divided into two main groups. The first concerns understanding and knowledge. The second group concerns meaning. So I'll start with the first. Metaphors are generally thought of to be informative. And that's very interesting because metaphors are often literally false or trivially true statements, right? But if I tell you reptiles are reptiles or mammals are mammals, those aren't informative statements if you know the meaning of the words reptiles and mammals. However, metaphors do seem to be informative, and the puzzle is how and why. Consider, for example, Bill is a bulldozer, or Will is a lion at heart, Jane is a real woman now. All of those statements seem to communicate something and inform you about something. But how do they do that? So metaphors in literature as well are actually used to convey information. One example is in Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's novel. Jane says, I am no bird, and no net ensnares me, to Mr. Rochester. Now, what she's communicating is that she isn't a trapped and fragile being. But how is she communicating this? Another domain in which metaphors are used to convey information is the natural sciences. So think of scientists speaking of the fabric of the space-time continuum, where this is used to elucidate a complex fact. Or think of evolutionary scientists talking about life trees, which is used to summarize a theory. And lastly, think of scientists talking about carbon footprints, right? This metaphor is used to emphasize the impact of carbon on our society and our lives. And metaphors are so effective in yielding and conveying information that philosophers use them a bunch, and they generally develop thought experiments where a hypothetical situation is laid out to reflect about the consequences of a certain everyday scenario. A good example of this is by Judith Jarvis Thompson, and her thought experiments goes like so, her most famous one. You wake up one day and you've been kidnapped by a group of fans of a famous violinist. And they tell you that the violinist is dying, and the reason they've kidnapped you is because you have a compatible blood, and they've connected you up to the violinist, and the violinist needs treatment for 9 months. Do we have a duty to stay plugged to the violinist? Well, this thought experiment, of course, is used to reflect on the morality of abortion, and the violinist is supposed to metaphorically stand for the fetus. There are a variety of theories about how metaphors convey information, and most philosophers right now, pioneered by a philosopher called Elizabeth Camp, have argued that metaphors convey information through framing effects. Camp defined framing effects or frames as representational vehicles with the function of expressing perspectives. And perspectives are dispositions to produce intuitive structures of thought about particular subjects. So the idea is that metaphors set up a so-called analogical equation between groups of related features from one domain to another. So take again Shakespeare's Juliet is the sun. Characteristic features of the sun are light, beauty, being at the center of the universe. And as such, we take those features and we restructure our construal of Juliet in those terms. So we come to see her as a bright beauty, or the center of Romeo's universe. And this, according to most, is how metaphors convey information. Now, the reason why metaphors are so effective in transmitting information is that they also appeal to our intuitive modes of thought, and they have a lot of sensory and imagistic effects. As I have said earlier, metaphors are literally false or trivially true statements, but they generally go beyond, we take them to go beyond what they literally express. And here I'm moving on to the next puzzle, which is about meaning. How can we say something that's literally false or trivially true, but yet it has a different meaning? So some have actually questioned whether we should be thinking about meaning at all, right? Don't metaphors just sort of give some cognitive effect and some images and sensory effects, but not really have any extra and above meaning other than their literal one? So famously, philosopher Donald Davidson says, a metaphor can, like a picture or a bump in the head, make us appreciate some fact, but not by standing for or expressing that fact. Nonetheless, the most prominent views right now do think that metaphor has something to do with meaning and that there is an extra metaphorical meaning. This meaning, however, is not literally said or expressed, it's implied. Now, to appreciate the difference between saying and implying, consider you asking me if our friend was late to my party. And I say, oh, you know her, she's always late. I haven't said, yes, she was late to the party, but I've implied that she was late to the party. And according to many, including Elizabeth Camp, who I've mentioned before, this is exactly how metaphors communicate their meaning. We find something common between two subjects, and that is the meaning implied. So when Jane Eyre says, no net ensnares me, I am no bird, what we do is we take features from birds, we connect them to Jane Eyre, and we infer, we see those features as implied by the speaker. Now, this is also where context plays a massive role, right? And interestingly, it's because, in this case, Jane is saying that she isn't a bird and that she's not ensnared. So it's hard to see how are we supposed to be connecting up common features. Well, the way that we do that is through context. So we obviously know that Mr. Rochester is much older than her, he holds a position of power over her, he has his ex-wife trapped in an attic, and we take those features, the features that are in the context already, connect them up with Jane, and then negate it. And that's how we understand that Jane is not a trapped, fragile bird, maybe like Bertha is Rochester's wife. And so given this knowledge, Jane is implying that she is different. Of course, like in all philosophical theories, there's still a bunch of things to be figured out and a lot of questions. One main one is exactly what do metaphors imply, if they imply anything. And the main issue is, if I give you a metaphor and you come up with an interpretation that I didn't intend at all, how did you get there, and did I imply that interpretation? Because I hadn't thought about it. So I talked to you before, for example, about Shakespeare's Juliet is the sun. And I said that one of the features that we can see as implied by that is the fact that Juliet is at the center of Romeo's universe. Well, the issue with that is that heliocentrism wasn't a very popular doctrine back then. It was actually banned by the church in 1616, and Romeo and Juliet was written about the 1590s. And so it's hard to see Shakespeare as believing in heliocentrism. Now, I don't think we have any proof that he did or did not, but it's very unlikely. And so we're attributing to someone a meaning that they just couldn't have had. And how is that possible? And the same goes with, if we agree that Shakespeare didn't imply that, does the metaphor itself still imply that? Or do we want to say that that's just not the meaning of the metaphor? So yes, these are just some of the many questions that philosophy has in common with literary theory, and that still haven't been solved. But mostly, I want to they say that people can come away with one, maybe two things from a talk. So if there's anything that you can come away with, is a question, because philosophy is all about questions. And that is a very deceivingly simple question, and it is, what do metaphors mean? Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? All right, so I talked to Andrew at dinner yesterday, and he said the rationale for choosing the Philosophy Prize winners is basically having one person from the so-called analytic tradition and one person from the continental tradition. If you don't know what that means, it's basically one person who speaks very clearly and one person who speaks very obscurely, which is me. So in a sense, my talk will be quite self-referential. The question which I want to raise today is, why do some philosophers use very experimental language to express their ideas? And is that a good idea? Is that a good thing? And obviously it's a very big question, so I want to focus on one area, on one philosopher who's particularly well known for having quite an obscure language, which is Martin Heidegger. And if you don't know him, he's famous for writing a book called Being in Time, which was published in 1927. And I think Heidegger is a particularly interesting philosopher to talk about when talking about language, just because of the way he pushes the boundaries of language. He's someone who writes in a very idiosyncratic, very distinctive style. So I think, aside from the fact that I just write my PhD thesis on Heidegger, I also think he's a good choice for this conference. And I think there's something to be said about Heidegger's style, which makes him so distinctive and different from other philosophers. So unlike, for example, Kant, the reason why Heidegger is so complicated is not that he uses lots of logical formulas or lots of standard philosophical terminology. In fact, most of the words he uses are quite common words, such as to be. It's just that he combines the words in such a wild way that they don't, they to the untrained mind don't really mean much. And so it's a really fascinating person to read, but also a very frustrating person to read. And actually, most people found him more frustrating than fascinating. So just to give you two examples from very different philosophical traditions, Adorno, the sort of key figure of critical theory, wrote an entire book called Jargon of Authenticity, where he basically says Heidegger uses language to cover up his bad arguments, which is pretty rich coming from someone who writes like Adorno. But on the other side of the philosophical spectrum, you have Carnap, who's sort of a logical positivist, and he also says Heidegger just writes nonsense. So it's like, I'm not sure you know Lewis Carroll's The Mad Gardener song, so it's just nonsense sentences, and that's kind of the same thing we find in Heidegger. Okay, so both Adorno and Carnap agree. They don't agree on much, but they agree on one thing, which is that Heidegger uses language in a very strange way. Adorno would even go further and say Heidegger intentionally misuses language. And that reminded me of something that John Searle, an American philosopher, once said. So Searle said in a radio interview that he talked to Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, and apparently Foucault came to Berkeley and gave a very clear talk. And then Searle asked Foucault, okay, this was a really clear talk, but in France you never speak so clearly, and in your books you never write so clearly. So why do you write so poorly? And apparently Foucault replied, in France you got to have 10% incomprehensible, otherwise people won't think you're profound. They won't think you're a deep thinker. And I think Foucault would have maybe said something similar about Heidegger, and Searle would have agreed. So Heidegger might be someone who intentionally obscures what he's trying to say. And basically what I want to do in the rest of my talk is just look a bit at Heidegger, take a bit of a closer look, and basically give you a rough indication of why that might not be the fairest characterization. Okay, so let's start by looking at Heidegger's language in a bit more detail. So as I've said, it's very experimental. Lots of stuff we could talk about. There's lots of neologisms. He nominalizes words. He hyphenates words to absurdity. He uses all kinds of weird philosophical structures of arguments, such as the tautology, the paradox, etc. So the thing I want to look at, the one selected example I want to discuss today, is what I call the semantic shift. So by a semantic shift, I mean a word which has a meaning in ordinary German or English, but is shifted. The meaning is shifted to something else. So it's kind of like a neologism, except that the word it has a meaning already. It's not a new word, right? And Heidegger uses that a lot. And one of the examples I want to discuss is the word Dasein, which isn't translated to English because of how complicated the use is, but it's D-A-S-E-I-N, which means, in ordinary German, it has two meanings actually. It means life. So for example, ein elendes Dasein führen means to lead a miserable life. And also it means more technically existence. So das Dasein Gottes is the existence of God. Right? So we have a word with an ordinary meaning in German, but Heidegger doesn't use the word in that way. He uses the word to mean person, individual human being. And that's a confusing use of language, right? It's not what we normally mean by the word. So I think the question to ask is, why does Heidegger do this, right? Why does he use a word which has a meaning in ordinary German and gives it a new meaning, shifts it semantically? And I think there are various reasons. I'm going to list three. So the first is negative. Heidegger thinks that the word human being or subject or self, these words, they have a certain philosophical baggage. They've been used for 2,000 years of history of philosophy, and they've given rise to all these questions. And what is a human being? What does it mean to be rational? What's the distinction between the mind, the world in there, the world out there, etc. So I think Heidegger doesn't want to invite these questions. He thinks they're bad philosophical questions, they're pseudo questions, and he doesn't want to discuss them. So he needs a new word to avoid this baggage. A second point, positive point, the word Dasein, as I've said, means life or existence. So he wants to say we are beings who are life, who are existence. We manifest existence. We are beings that exist. It's just what defines us. So he's holding on to the usual connotation of the word, but in a transformative way. And then the third is very interesting, I think. The literal meaning of the word Dasein in German is, so da means there. So Dasein means being there, right? So basically what Heidegger is saying, we are not human beings, we are beings who are there, right? So I am not defined by my height, by my weight, by certain properties that I have. I am someone who's on the stage here, talking to you, interacting with you at dinner, and so forth. That's what I am. So I think for these three reasons, the word Dasein is particularly well suited to the kind of way of talking about what human beings are, which Heidegger is getting at. So I think that's a way in which Heidegger uses language to get at a particular philosophical point, which has a justification and serves a point in his system. Okay, that's just one example of a linguistic innovation which we find in Heidegger, but I think it already gives you some sense of why someone like Adorno and Carnap might be too hasty, in attacking Heidegger for his language. I want to end my talk by raising a question, or coming back to the question which I've raised at the beginning, which is, why do philosophers experiment with language? And I want to apply that to Heidegger. So the question becomes, is it a good or a bad thing that Heidegger writes the way in which he does? Is there a kind of necessity dictated by the kinds of things he wants to say? Or is it more of a frustrating thing, a nuisance, a hurdle for us as readers who want to access his thoughts? And I think the example of Dasein basically shows it's not a hurdle. It actually does something. It helps us to better appreciate the kind of philosophy he's trying to get at. But I think someone might object here that, even though Heidegger has a point by using language in a way which doesn't weigh him down, which lets him escape certain philosophical problems, he shouldn't do that. You shouldn't use language in that way because it's important we talk about these problems. That's just what philosophy is, right? We want to define what a human being is. We want to define what subjectivity is. And so it's sort of intellectually dishonest to just pick a different word. You're just making up your own language to talk about something else. You're not really engaging with philosophy. And I think, that would be a good objection if Heidegger thought these problems were real problems. So problems such as, is there a world out there? Am I the only person that exists? Yada, yada. And he doesn't, right? He doesn't think that these are good problems. So I think there's an interesting parallel between Heidegger and Wittgenstein, which is often pointed out, which is that both of these philosophers have a sort of destructive view of language. So Wittgenstein is someone who famously, I think Jacob actually quoted it in the beginning of the conference. Wittgenstein famously said, well, actually, I didn't really want to get to that citation quite yet. Sorry for the quite bit loopy part of my speech. But Wittgenstein is someone who offers a kind of therapy. I will get to the citation. Wittgenstein offers a kind of people think Wittgenstein offers a kind of philosophical therapy, right? He wants to show philosophers that the way they use language is misleading. Philosophers get confused by their own language, and that leads into all kinds of philosophical problems. And I think Heidegger, basically the point I was trying to make in the slightly funny way is that Heidegger agrees with Wittgenstein on this in this regard. But I want to say that Heidegger disagrees with Wittgenstein in a further regard, which is that Wittgenstein doesn't think philosophy can be anything positive. So Wittgenstein, and that's another citation, not the one Jacob quoted, famously said that if someone were to advance theses in philosophy, it would never be possible to debate them because everyone would agree on them. So what that really means is philosophy's task is to describe the world. It's not to say anything substantive, not to offer theses, right? Not to say anything controversial. And I think Heidegger disagrees, right? Heidegger is someone who thinks philosophy can say something, but he still agrees with Wittgenstein that the language of philosophy isn't normally suited to do that. So that leads him in a kind of weird position where he wants to say something, but he thinks our language isn't suited for that task. And so Heidegger actually says in the beginning of Being and Time, for the central task of what I'm trying to do here, we lack not only most of the words, but above all, the grammar. And let me end my talk by basically also saying that Heidegger is someone who struggled a lot with language. I'm talking here about early Heidegger because it's the person I know and I'm working on. But in his later work, so post-Nazi times, Heidegger thought a lot about language, and he basically the theme underlying all of this is the inability of language to say the kinds of things that we needed to say. And now I'll get to the citation, which is the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, right? So Heidegger basically thought something very similar and really struggled with that in his later work, which is how can we say the things we need to say as philosophers? And I think the questions raised by that are basically questions which are quite close to the heart of this conference, which are, is there really something if I cannot say it? And what is the relationship between poetry and philosophy? And because of that, I want to end my talk by reading a poem, which is actually a poem Heidegger often discussed in his lectures in the sort of 50s. It's much nicer in German, but I'll read it in a, I think, good translation in English. The poem is The Word by Stefan George from 1919, and here it goes. From dream or distance I would bring to my land's border some strange thing, then wait until the grey dawn came, and from her well fished out its name. Then I could take good hold of it, and now all round it flowers bright. Once, from a voyage blessed with luck, I brought a fragile gemstone back. She looked and said, "It's clear, there's no name waiting for that here." Whereon it slipped out of my hand and never came to grace my land. I learned the rules through suffering. Where no word is, can be no thing. Thank you.